Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of A Little Bit Healthier. Today, I'd like to talk to you about blood sugar insulin and how it affects weight loss. I have so many people coming to me saying, I'm trying to do everything right, and I just can't seem to lose the extra weight. We know that weight loss isn't just about calories in and calories out, like we've been told for so long, that there's definitely a hormonal component. And one of the most important hormones when it comes to weight loss is insulin. Every time we eat, we have glucose in our blood. In order for the glucose to give us energy, we actually need to get it into our cells. Having glucose in your blood doesn't do anything for you as far as energy generation. You need to have it in your cells to get the generation of energy that you need in order to use it as fuel. That's where insulin comes in. As your blood glucose rises, insulin is then signals from the pancreas to be released. Our cells have receptors on them that are gatekeepers. Think of a lock and key, and the insulin acts as the key to let the glucose into the cell. In insulin resistance, the receptors are bathed in sugar and insulin for long periods of time and become resistant to the insulin and therefore will not let the glucose into the cell the way it should. When this happens, we need more insulin to get the glucose into the cell. So insulin will go up. You can think of insulin as a storage hormone. The cell is looking for direction, and the insulin is telling it to store, taking the glucose out of the blood and putting it into the cell. In an insulin-resistant cell, insulin receptors are less efficient at binding with the insulin, and less sugar is absorbed. It is saying the cell is full, and more sugar remains in circulation and ends up getting stored as fat. Glucose is first stored as glycogen in the liver, but this can only happen for about 2,000 calories a day at the most. Then what's left over is stored as triglycerides, and therefore adipose tissue or body fat. And this is where we start to see that fat buildup. One of the other functions of insulin is to block lipolysis, and lipolysis breaks down stored triglycerides and body fat. So having more insulin blocks us from breaking down the stored triglycerides and the stored body fat. So we are getting it in two different ways. This is telling our bodies that we actually don't want to use fat as fuel. And when this happens, you start to see that resistance to your weight loss because your body's being signaled to store and not use the glucose as fuel. You may also notice that you start to feel exhausted and have more cravings, which can become a vicious cycle for a lot of people. The good news is that this is absolutely modifiable. Insulin can be easily lowered in response to diet, movement, sleep, and stress management. When you go to your doctor as part of your regular blood work, you're often given a fasting blood glucose check. And while this is a good marker, along with hemoglobin A1C, eventually in metabolic dysfunction, what we want to ask for in the early stages is actually an insulin level. Insulin can show us early stages of metabolic dysfunction before we see the rise in fasting blood glucose. This is because with the rise of insulin in the beginning, more glucose is actually pushed into the cell. So you may see the rise of insulin before you actually see the rise in blood sugar. If you're in the early stages, you want to see this fasting insulin. And if the insulin is going up, you know you need to make some lifestyle changes in order not to get the full metabolic syndrome. And I think that's another factor in conventional medicine. We're often waiting until we have diabetes for treatment. We're watching insulin go up. We're watching that fasting blood sugar go up. And we're waiting until we're using a medication to treat it. But as you're waiting, that gap grows wider and wider. Because as I said, these are modifiable changes. So you're probably asking, well, you're saying they're modifiable, but what should I do? What we want to do is focus on decreasing insulin. And one of the main things you can do is reduce your carbohydrate intake. And there are many tracking apps out there. You can actually track your food and look at the comparison of your macronutrients. You can see how many carbohydrates you're getting in comparison to fats and proteins. And this is actually a good wake-up call. I do this with a lot of people I work with. And I think the realization of how many carbohydrates are a part of your diet can be quite startling. Once you start to track, if you have a food tracker, then you want to look at your daily percentages. You want to look at your carbohydrates to be under about 30% of your daily food intake. And with some people, actually, when we're trying to get insulin down, want to stay closer to 10 to 20. for that period. You also want to reset what you think of a carbohydrate. And we so often think of carbohydrates as pastas and bread, and actually there's many more foods that contain carbohydrates. We're thinking of vegetables and fruits and different foods that also have carbohydrate content. We want to focus on these foods when we're counting our carbs. You want to eat those first before refined foods like pastas and breads. Increasing your protein level also improves blood sugar control and can also help you feel fuller longer and preserve lean body mass. And when you're eating your carbohydrates, you can also eat a protein so you can bind those two together. So increasing exercise helps insulin move sugar out of the bloodstream and into the muscle cells. So we want to make sure that we're getting exercise and that you have movement in your life. I tell people all the time, you don't have to climb a mountain. You just have to add simple things into your life. So if you're thinking, I don't have time for a regular exercise routine, it doesn't have to be an hour every day. If you do things like take a walk around the block, take a walk between meetings, you can park farther away from the grocery store. You can take the steps rather than the elevator. There are all sorts of things you can do every day that just increase movement. You want to make sure that you're moving. Ideally, you would want to try to get exercise at least probably 30 minutes a few days a week. But really, anything you can do helps. And any movement you get can help you really decrease the syndrome. Another thing we really want to look at stress levels. In another episode, I talk about hormones that impact weight and fat storage because it can be complicated. But one thing I wanted to review right now is that an increase in cortisol, our stress hormone, can also tell the body to store fat. So really working on things that decrease your stress level and your cortisol can be very helpful. Because often when we see this increase in cortisol and the storage of body fat, it's actually that visceral fat, which is the fat around the middle area, around the stomach. And we can pack weight around our middle. And it can affect actually our organs. In that kind of visceral fat, we can actually get adipose tissue on the organs in the abdominal area. So really doing things to decrease those stress levels like meditation, deep breathing, exercise, or anything that brings you into a parasympathetic nervous system, that really calm place. Increasing your fiber is another thing that can help. Eating more foods high in dietary fiber has shown beneficial improvements in insulin sensitivity by slowing down the rise of blood sugar after a meal. So increasing your fiber intake can be important. Most of us don't actually get the daily required amount of fiber. So it's another thing that's really good to make sure you're adding because it also helps with digestion. Staying hydrated is also helpful. Staying hydrated will keep you feeling full longer. It will decrease your overall daily calories because you won't have as many cravings or be as hungry. And getting enough sleep is also important. This is actually something we're not thinking about when it comes to insulin resistance and weight loss usually, but there are studies showing that even just a few hours of impaired sleep can contribute to insulin resistance. So getting enough sleep and really getting your body into that calm place and getting those cortisol levels down at night is important in the process. And if this is something you're really committed to, the other thing you can do is invest in a continuous glucose monitor. This can give you personalized information on the way that your body individually responds to food. We're all unique and we all have very different reactions to things. So you can't always do a one-size-fits-all approach, but getting a continuous glucose monitor can help you dial in and see exactly where your body's responding to the foods and what foods are spiking your blood sugar. And it can be different for everyone. Everyone has different responses and everybody's blood sugar can spike for different things. We know general patterns, but it is a really unique way to dial in. I hope this episode gave you some good information as to where you can get started to look at your insulin. Really pay attention to your insulin. And next time you're going to the doctor, ask for it to be checked and see where your levels are. Are they high? Is this something you really need to focus on? And then start to commit to it. As I said, the sooner you do this and the more committed you are to getting them down, the easier it is. I recently heard a quote that 1 in 3 Americans are expected to have some sort of metabolic syndrome. And this is really staggering when you think about it, because it's something we can control. It doesn't have to be this way, but we're really set up in a place that promotes it. We're eating things on a regular basis that are setting us up for metabolic syndrome. The standard American diet is shifting us to that direction. So it's something you really want to start looking at. Simple changes in your life can make a huge difference. And if you start now, the gap is so much smaller. You can come back. You don't have to cross a chasm that happens once you really have had cell damage in metabolic syndrome. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode and have a great day.